Think about the last big decision you made. Maybe it was a job, a relationship, a city. You probably believe you chose it. You probably believe that choice says something true about who you are. But what if the version of you that made that choice was already written, not by experience, not by environment, but by something that happened long before you ever took your first breath? That is not a metaphor. That is the question researchers have been quietly answering for decades. And the real answer is far stranger than you have been told. You have a personality. You know this. You are either the kind of person who walks into a room and talks to strangers, or you are the kind who finds a corner and waits. You either crave novelty or you avoid it. You either feel anxiety crawling through your chest on ordinary days, or you wonder why other people seem so tightly wound. You did not choose any of that. But here's what most people never stop to ask. When exactly was it decided? Most people assume the answer is childhood. Trauma shapes you. Parenting shapes you. Your school, your friends, your first heartbreak, all of it layers onto a blank surface and creates the person you eventually become. That story feels right. It feels fair. It implies that with enough therapy and enough effort, you can become someone different. But the science tells a different story. In the 1990s, behavioral geneticist Robert Plomin published findings that would quietly shake the foundations of developmental psychology. Plomin and his colleagues spent years studying twins, identical twins raised together, identical twins raised apart, and fraternal twins in both conditions. What they found was not what most scientists expected. Personality traits like extroversion, neuroticism, conscientiousness, and openness to new experience were, across study after study, roughly 40 to 60% heritable. Not shaped by shared environment, not created by the home you grew up in. Genetic, coded into you before you were born. Read that again. The way you experience anxiety, the way you process novelty, the degree to which you feel empathy. These are not just influenced by your genes. They are substantially determined by them. But it goes even deeper than that. Your personality does not begin at birth. It begins before birth. Research into fetal behavior, how a developing child moves, responds to sound, reacts to stress inside the womb, shows measurable individual differences as early as the third trimester. Some fetuses are highly reactive, startling easily, moving frequently, responding intensely to external stimuli. Others are calm, slow to react, steady in their patterns. Jerome Kagan, a developmental psychologist at Harvard, spent decades tracking children from infancy into adolescence and found that this early temperamental difference, what he called high reactivity and low reactivity, predicted with striking consistency how those children would respond to the world years later. The highly reactive infants became cautious, anxious, introverted adolescents. The low reactive infants became bold, sociable, emotionally stable. The world had changed around them. The pattern had not. So something was there before the first breath, before the first face, before the first word spoken by a parent who believed they were shaping a blank slate. What exactly was decided? Your baseline mood, your sensitivity to threat, how quickly you recover from setbacks, how much stimulation you need before you feel alive versus overwhelmed, how much uncertainty you can tolerate before your nervous system begins to scream. All of this, your emotional temperature, appears to be set early and to resist dramatic change across a lifetime. Not because you are trapped, but because your brain was built a certain way, and building is not the same as choosing. Here is where neuroscience enters the conversation. The amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure deep in your brain, is your threat detection system. It fires when something feels dangerous, uncertain, or new. In people with high neuroticism, the amygdala fires more often, more intensely, and for longer. In people with low neuroticism, it is quieter, more reluctant to sound the alarm. Research using brain imaging has shown that these differences in amygdala reactivity are stable across years. They are present in childhood. They track with genetic markers. And they are tied directly to the personality traits you experience as simply being you. The nervousness you feel before a presentation, the way a crowded room drains you while it energizes the person beside you, the fact that you sometimes feel sadness for no clear reason. None of that is weakness. None of that is a choice. It is architecture. But here's the part that stops most people cold. If your personality is substantially genetic, and if your genes are a combination of your parents' genes, which are combinations of their parents' genes, then, in a very real sense, your personality is the echo of people you never met. The anxiety in your chest might have helped a great-great-grandmother survive a famine. The boldness that makes you take risks might be the same trait that drove an ancestor to cross an ocean, to climb a mountain, to leave a village and never look back. You are not just yourself. You are a living archive of people whose names you will never know, carrying forward the traits that allowed them to survive long enough to pass them on. David Lykken, a psychologist at the University of Minnesota who spent his career studying twins, proposed what he called the set point theory of happiness. He argued that each person has a genetically influenced baseline level of well-being, a kind of emotional home base to which they return regardless of external circumstances. Lottery winners, his studies found, returned to their baseline happiness within a year of their windfall. People who had suffered serious accidents and become paraplegic also returned over time to something close to their pre-injury emotional state. The events changed. The person stayed roughly the same, not because people lack resilience, but because the baseline was always there, pulling them back toward the personality they were built to have. Does that mean nothing matters? Does experience do nothing? Not exactly. What the research suggests is something more nuanced and more honest. Your genes set the range. Your environment determines where within that range you land. Imagine a thermostat with a fixed minimum and maximum temperature. The room can shift the dial. But the dial cannot go below the floor or above the ceiling that the thermostat was built to hold. You are not infinitely malleable. But you are not rigidly fixed either. You have a nature, and that nature can be expressed in different ways, depending on the life you lead, the habits you build, the relationships you choose, and the environments you place yourself in. The problem is that most people spend their entire lives trying to become someone outside their range, trying to force extroversion when their nervous system was built for depth and quiet, trying to eliminate anxiety when that anxiety is a finely tuned early warning system that has kept your family line alive for generations, trying to be spontaneous when your brain is literally wired for careful, deliberate planning, and then blaming themselves when it does not work. There is something important in understanding that the version of you sitting here right now is not a rough draft. It is not an incomplete version of some ideal self that better choices would have created. It is the result of a long biological conversation that began before you existed, written in the genetic material of people who survived long enough to reach tomorrow and handed to you as the starting point of a life you are only beginning to understand. The psychologist Brian Little spent decades studying what he called personal projects, the goals, tasks, and roles that people voluntarily take on and pursue over time. He found that even highly introverted people could act extroverted for sustained periods when the goal mattered enough to them. A shy scientist could command a lecture hall. A deeply anxious person could lead a team through a crisis. But the moment the project ended, the moment the role was no longer required, the person returned immediately and fully to themselves. The biology was always waiting, patient, certain, unmoved. That is not a tragedy. That is a map, because if you know your range, you can stop fighting it and start working with it. You can build a life that fits the nervous system you were given instead of punishing yourself for not fitting a life designed for someone else. You can recognize the anxiety not as a flaw to be eliminated, but as information to be read. You can see the restlessness not as a sign that something is wrong with you, but as a signal about what your particular brain requires to feel alive. Most people never receive this information. They go through life with a deep, nagging sense that they are somehow wrong, too sensitive, too quiet, too cautious, too intense, and they spend enormous amounts of energy trying to correct a self that was never broken to begin with. You came into this world with a personality already forming, already leaning toward something, already carrying the biological memory of ancestors who felt what you feel, feared what you fear, and found a way to survive it anyway. So the next time you feel like the version of you that showed up today is not the version you were supposed to be, consider the possibility that the version that showed up is exactly the one that was always coming. Not because your story is already written, but because the author has been working on it far longer than you realized. You thought you decided who you were, but the decision started long before you arrived.